Poetry, by its very nature, is usually written in lines and stanzas. It is one of the genres of literature organized in lines and stanzas. One of the genres of literature organized in lines and stanzas. And I'm saying that this is the formalist definition of poetry. This is the formalist definition of poetry. Both the formalist and the structuralist would define poetry to emphasize the form and structure of poetry. And that is that poetry is organized in lines and stanzas. Prose is organized in paragraphs and chapters. Drama is organized in acts and scenes. And this is how we distinguish formally, structurally, the different genres of literature. But for poetry, you are looking at what? Lines and stanzas. The formalists and the structuralists define poetry as a genre of literature organized in lines and stanzas. Poetry is also the shortest of the three genres of literature. Poetry is also the shortest. Poetry is also the shortest of the three genres of literature. Poetry is also the shortest of the three genres of literature. The shortest of the three genres of literature. Shortest of the three genres of literature, right? Sometimes one poem can just be one page, at most 2 pages, not even more than 3 pages, all right? So you can see that poems are very short, and that means that the poet, the writer of poetry, is a poet, all right? The poet, the writer of poetry, the writer of a poem, has limited space for his art. The writer of poetry has what? Limited space for his art. Compared to the writer of prose or to the writer of drama, the writer of poetry has limited space to practice his art. So apart from the epic which is no longer being written, the genre of poetry is the shortest of the three genres of literature. The three genres of literature. So because of the limitation of space, the writer of poetry has to have what we call the skill in economizing words. So poetry is usually marked by economy of words. You cannot define poetry without mentioning what? Economy of words. And why do we have economy of words in poetry? Because the poet does not have enough space to practice his art compared to the novelist or to the dramatist. So the poet has to say everything that he or she has to say within the limited space afforded him or her by the art itself, by the nature of the art itself. So that is why you have economy of words, meaning that the poet has to choose his words carefully, so that at the end of the day we do not have wastages of words. We don't waste words. In poetry there's no opportunity, you cannot afford to waste words. Each word is important in the poem. So that is what we mean by economy of words. So poetry is marked by the genre of literature, characterized by economy of words. Poetry is a genre of literature that is characterized by what? An economy of words. In fact, when we use the word diction, it applies mostly to poetry. Diction means word choice or choice of words. So the poet has to do what? Choose words carefully to serve his end, to serve his purpose in the writing of poetry. Now, the economy of words usually results in another characteristic feature of poetry, which we also need to define poetry, which is opacity. Poetry is also marked by what? Opacity. Opacity. Opacity relates to the difficulty in meaning, usually associated with poetry. Opacity relates to the difficulty in meaning that is usually associated with poetry. Difficulty in meaning, usually associated with poetry. It's what we call opacity, meaning that poetry is largely opaque. Poetry is a genre of literature known for its being opaque. This is adjective, opaque. The noun form is opacity. Difficulty, there's a certain level of difficulty associated with reading and understanding poetry. And this is where most students usually run away, because they think that poetry is difficult. But by the time we are done with this course, you will see that poetry is not difficult at all, but that it is a game that both the writer and the reader play. It's a game that both the writer and the reader play. It's like a hide and seek game, where the poet hides meaning and the reader goes to find it. It's a beautiful game. So poetry, when viewed from that perspective, is not difficult at all. So you want to see poetry as word game, any word game out there, right? where you have to hunt for meaning. And so the pleasure is in the chase. Pleasure is in the what? The chase. Pleasure is in the chase. And you're chasing for the meaning that the poet has hidden somewhere in the lexis of the poem. So one of the characteristics of poetry is opacity, difficulty in meaning. But I am telling you that poetry is not difficult to understand at all. That what happens is that poets normally write to do what? To hide meaning. Even the simplest poems invite you to read it beyond the surface meaning. That's what poetry is. Even the simplest poems still invite you to read it beyond the surface meaning. You have to go deeper, dig deeper in order to get at the meaning of it. And that is what makes poetry pleasurable. So instead of seeing poetry as difficult, see it as a word game. Poetry is a word game. In which the poet and the reader participate. Where the poet hides meaning and the reader goes there to find meaning. And you can imagine the joy that you find as a reader when you finally decode the meaning of the poem. It gives you some psychological satisfaction. It makes you feel like an achiever. It rewards, and it is rewarding to the intellect to be able to know finally what the poet has meant. So you could see that one of the reasons you should love poetry is that it challenges your intellect. It makes you think. It makes you exercise your brain. And there's no other exercise that is as good as the exercise of the brain. It is exercise of the mind. Because you see, poetry is at the apogee of the human word power. Right? Poetry is at the apogee of the human word power. Poetry is at the apex. Alright? Apex of the human word power. When we talk about speech refinement at its highest point, you get it in poetry. Because you see, poets are closest to God when it comes to creation. Because God used words to create the world. Alright? And poets use words to recreate God's creation, which is the word. So God and poets are co-creators. Okay? So this is why we must give respect to poets, because they are the closest to God in terms of creation. And I've already said, and that's because poetry is at the apex of the human word power. And words are used to manifest reality. And the only raw material that the poet uses is what? Words. The artist might use his canvas to draw. Excuse me, the sculptor might use his mud to mold. All that the poet has are words, which God also used in creating the world. And so, if the poet wants you to laugh, he will simply use words. If the poet wants you to cry, he will simply use words, no other thing. If the poet wants you to be motivated, to take action, he will also use words. The poet wants you to be sad, he will also use words. Because, let me tell you a secret, words are very powerful. Right? Words are very powerful. Because in the beginning was there, and the Word was with. See? And the Word was. That's why you have to respect words. Because they work with words. And word is God. Word is magic. Word creates, and words creates and recreates the world. Words are used to manifest different forms of realities. And so, which is why you, even when you are not a poet, you should be careful of what you say about yourself and about others. Because they are very powerful. Okay? That's why sometimes people say when you wake up in the mornings, you should make affirmative statements about yourself, like I am powerful, I am beautiful, I am brilliant, I am successful, I am strong, I am healthy, because that's exactly what you're going to manifest. Okay? You don't just wake up in the morning and just like, how is today look like? Why am I a failure? I'm not even handsome, not even beautiful, things are so bad. Okay? So you speak realities through the power of the word, which is what poets do. And this happens when you read or listen to poetry, you feel the power. Like when I started the class with the quote from Angelus Point, you will see that it was different from the ordinary speech that anybody could have spoken at that moment. Okay? So this is why you must surmount any difficulty that you might have in order to be a poet. Not just to be a lover of poetry, but to be a writer of poetry. Because you have that innate talent. Okay? To be a poet. To command words, command language, and use that command to influence, change, or even to disrupt society. But of course, if you're going to be a poet, you have to be a good one who uses his poetry to bring about positive changes in society, not to create confusion. Because again, you have to remember that words are very powerful. So we can then go on to define poetry as the best that is thought, and said in the world. Poetry is the best that is thought and spoken. The best that is thought and spoken in the world. The best that is thought and written in the world. Poetry is the very best of human speech power. Poetry is the best that is thought and written. Best that is thought. The best that is thought and what? Written in the world. Poetry is in a class of its own. People could write anything they want to write, but nothing moves than poetry. So, apart from the formal definition of poetry, you can also define poetry depending on your orientation, your ideological orientation. Poetry can be defined depending on the individual's ideological orientation. Individual's ideological orientation. For instance, if you are a romantic poet, you will define poetry differently from maybe a modernist poet. The romantic poet will define poetry as a spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility. And they embody the spirit of romanticism. Alright? Embody the spirit of romanticism. Poetry, according to the romantic writers, romantic poets, is a spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility. A spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. Tranquility. A spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. So the very ideology of romanticism, which we will talk about when we get to poetry tradition, predisposes the romantic poets to define poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility. Because romantic poetry values emotion, feelings, respects nature. So poetry is usually inspired. As far as the romantic poets are concerned, poetry is an inspired art. If you're not inspired by anything, you cannot write good poetry. You have to be inspired. But for the romantic poets, they are inspired by nature. They go out into the nature and they see something fascinating. When they come back, the recollection, the remembrance of that encounter is what informs their poetry, what they write down. So it comes with emotion or remembrance of an encounter that the poet has with nature. So when you read this kind of poetry, you see the author's personality in it, the author's feeling in it. And you have to understand the poem. You have to understand the poem based on how the author feels while writing it. Poetry is all about the expression of beauty. Poetry is all about the expression of beauty. Poetry is the expression of the beauty in nature. Poetry is the expression of the beauty in nature. The world is a beautiful place as far as the poets are concerned. You have many features that make the world beautiful, like the sun, the moon, the morning, the night, the birds in the sky, the sounds of animals, the sound of life when you wake up in the morning, dreams. These things make the world beautiful. And poets try to capture this beauty in words. Alright? The job of the poet is to try and capture the beauty inherent in nature in words for us to see. That's why a poet might see an artwork and then describes it in poetic words. The poet might encounter a sunset and decides to describe how it feels, how it looks in words. So those who appreciate poetry usually do so to see the aesthetics in poetry. Because aesthetics means what? Beauty. So it means beauty. This class is an intelligent class. So again, that takes us back to how poets relate to Godhood. Alright? How poets relate to the Godhood. So we have many definitions of poetry. From writers around the world. And you too should have your own definition of poetry, what poetry means to you. Apart from everything that we have said about poetry. Some writers believe that poetry should be difficult, hard to understand. Others believe that poetry should be simple for everyone to understand. So the writers who believe that poetry should be difficult write using difficult diction. And we call them obscurantists. To them, poetry is the art that wears a mask. Poetry is the art that wears a mask. Like Shoyinka, like J.P. Clark. Their poems are difficult for the average mind. Like Okibo. So you have to remove the masks to know what is behind it. Because as long as you look at the mask, you won't know what it is. The mask hides the real self, the real meaning. So poetry is a masquerade at some point, right? Poetry is a masquerade. You know how difficult it is to know the identity of a masquerade? while the mask is on, because it's the mask that makes the masquerade. And in some cultures, in most cultures, it is taboo to know the identity of the masquerade. So it's as if these writers write so that we should never know the meaning of the poem. Okay? Simply take the poem by its mask. But as critics, you have to go beyond the mask to know what the real identity is. Okay? Well, sometimes some people can't know the masquerade by the mask. Sometimes they use the walking step of the masquerade, how the masquerade walks, and say, that's Okun. That masquerade is Okun. That's exactly how Okun normally walks. Alright? Because you can't know from the mask. And then some writers believe that poetry should be simple so that everyone can understand. You and I will be able to understand. Right? Poetry should be like a democracy, the art of the people, by the people and for the people. And one of such writers is Neo Shindari. One of such writers is Neo Shindari. According to him, poetry is man meaning to man. Poetry is man meaning to man. According to Neo Shindari, poetry is man meaning to man. That implies that the poet has to communicate and should not be like the obscurantists, Shoyinka, J.P. Clark, Okibo. Alright? But the poet should be a communicator. So that when he speaks, everybody understands. When he writes, everybody understands. Poetry is man, meaning to man. Meaning that you do not necessarily write to confuse, to confound. The poet should not write to confuse or to confound. The poet should not write to confuse or to confound, but to communicate meaning. Right? Poetry is man, meaning to man. And I have the complete poem here. So I will just read so that you see where he takes that idea, that definition of poetry. That poetry is man, meaning to man. Poetry is not the exoteric whisper of an excluding tongue, not a claptrap for a wandering audience, not a learned quiz entombed in Greco-Roman law. Poetry is a live spring which gathers timber. The more throats it plows, a harbinger of action. The more marks it stays, the more minds it stays. Poetry is the hawker's ditty, the eloquence of the song, the lyric of the marketplace, a luminous ray on the grass morning dew. Poetry is what the soft wind musics to the dancing leaf, what the soul tells the dusty path, what the bee hums to the alluring nectar. What rainfall croons to the lowering eaves. Poetry is no oracle's kennel for a soul philosopher's stone. Poetry is man meaning to man. So maybe I'll just make you write down the final stanza. Poetry is no oracle's kennel for a soul philosopher's stone. Poetry is no oracle's kennel for a soul philosopher's stone. Poetry is man meaning to man. Poetry is not the exoteric whisper of an excluding tongue, not a claptrap for a wandering audience, not a learned quiz entombed in Greco-Roman law. So in that first stanza, Neil Shindler says that poetry is not a whisper, something that you say that not everybody can hear. You whisper, although some of you, when you whisper, it's a loud noise in the class, right? But normally, conventionally, a whisper has to be something that you say to one person, not to everyone. So, by poetry, not being a whisper, is like saying poetry is not something that you write only for the elite, only for the highly educated, so that they alone will know what you're saying and not the general masses. Okay? An excluding tongue means selected people who know a certain language. You know that sometimes people can speak English and you wonder whether it is English that they're speaking. Why is the same English that you've been learning since you were born that they're speaking? Because you don't even understand a word. Alright? Yeah. So excluding tongue, that's what it means. So this selects highly intellectual people who speak English and then you're lost. Alright? You don't even know whether that's English or not. That's what it means by excluding tongue. Not a claptrap. Claptrap is like people, all these uneducated people who don't understand the language. And so when they hear big words that they don't understand, they simply clap. Alright? Even if that word is insulting to them, they're still clapping. It happened during the colonial era when we had interpreters. People did not really go to school. Alright? So whatever the interpreter says, that the white man has said, that's what the people will take. Alright? So it's not a claptrap for a wandering audience. This audience don't know what this person is saying. But because the words sound so good, the words are sounding big, bombastic, so they keep clapping. Right? For the words without understanding what they said. Not a learned quiz. Learned quiz is an examination. Alright? Entombed in Greco-Roman law. All these poets, Kibo, Shirinka, they normally write using diction drawn from classical Greek and Roman poetry, which makes that poetry difficult to understand. That's what it means by Greco-Roman. Greco-Roman law. And Oshindara is simply attacking the use of classical allusion by these obscurantists in their poetry, which makes it difficult for ordinary people in our time to understand what they are writing about. Because most of these people have not heard of the name of this god, Apollo, right, Venus, that they use to know what metaphor that implies in the poem. So it might be difficult if you use Greco-Roman diction in writing poetry. That's what Neil Shunda is talking about. That's not what poetry is all about. A learned quiz, difficult exam. Something for highly learned is about that you've gone to school, at least you have a degree. But most of the masses are not educated, and so you cannot write poetry to confound them and expect that something will change in society. If you are going to write the kind of poetry that we call socially committed poetry, then you have to write in such a way that even the least educated member of the masses will really understand what you're saying. And that's when change can come about. Because you see, the poet is, among other things, someone who can mobilize the masses. But if you write in ways that the masses don't understand, then there's not going to be any action. Because you have to first communicate before action can be taken. If you just say something to me, and I don't understand what you're asking me to do, then I'm going to be confused. I'm not going to do anything that you want me to do. I'm even going to do the opposite. Which is why the poet has to do what? Has to communicate. Okay, so not a learned quiz, not something for the highly educated. The masses are not highly educated. So Shundara is calling for simple diction, the writing of contemporary poetry. If that poetry is aimed for the masses to take action and probably liberate themselves from oppression, any form of oppression. So poetry is man, meaning to man, as far as Neil Shunda is concerned. Archibald MacLeish has also defined poetry. Please help us. Archibald MacLeish says that a poem should not mean but be. A poem should not mean but be. A poem should not mean but be. Archibald MacLeish says that a poem should not mean but be. A poem should not mean but be. Poem. But be. But be. A poem should not mean but be. This definition emphasizes the ontological essence of poetry. That is the ontological essence of poetry. This definition emphasizes the ontological essence of poetry, the existence of poetry. All right? And it comes from the formalist orientation. That's a formalist orientation. This definition comes from the formalist perspective. Because in this definition, meaning is not emphasized. Meaning is not emphasized, but being is emphasized. Structure is emphasized. Form is emphasized. Okay? Please take note, because if we ask you to define poetry, we don't want one-line answer. We want you to say everything that we have said about the definition of poetry since we started this class. Okay? So if they say, what is poetry? You say, this question is very simple. Have you seen how simple this question is? You just say we should define poetry. And then you write one line. You have to say everything that you know about poetry makes up poetry. That's the definition of poetry. Okay? So this definition emphasizes the formal quality of poetry and not the meaning of the poem. That is the formalist way of seeing poetry. The structuralist way of seeing poetry. Poetry must exist. It must exist. Okay? First of all, before it means something. So the structure is emphasized, the form is emphasized in this definition. Poetry should not mean but be, because it is that being that determines its meaning in the first place. In formalism, we use the form of the poem to understand what it means. In structuralism, we use the structure of the poem to understand what it means. So meaning is not important. What is important is the being. When you know the structure, you know the meaning of the poem. When you know the form of the poem, you know the meaning of the poem. Poetry should not mean but be. Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Samuel Taylor. Another romantic writer has also defined poetry. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, another romantic writer, has also defined poetry. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, another romantic writer, also defined poetry. And he says poetry has the best words in the best order. Best words in the best order. The best words in the best order. This definition emphasizes the rhythm, the uniformity, and the orderliness often observed in poetry. The rhythm, uniformity, and the orderliness often observed in what? In poetry. The best words in the best order. Emphasizes the rhythm, the uniformity, the orderliness that poetry stands for. This is because poetry borrows the order and the beauty in nature. Poetry borrows from the order. Poetry borrows from the order and the beauty that exists in nature. Poetry, like creation, does not happen by chance. Poetry, like any form of creation, any form of creativity, does not happen by chance. Someone has to sit down and do what? And plan for it. So the poet aims to recreate in poetry the order that exists, the beauty that exists in nature. Which is why poetry is usually marked by orderliness. The poet is careful in everything he does or she does, in word choice, in the arrangement of the lines, and so on and so forth. Is to achieve the same orderliness that is observed in nature, the same rhythm, the same regularity. So sometimes you could see in the poems of old times, before we started writing free verse, the poets would ensure that each line has the same number of syllables. Each stanza has the same number of lines. That orderliness will be maintained throughout. The poet can decide to write 3 lines per stanza, 4 lines per stanza. That's what we are talking about. You can decide that each line will have 8 syllables, and you see it running through the entire poem. The poet can decide that he or she is going to have a particular way of rhyme, particular rhyme scheme, and he will maintain that throughout the poem. So you could see that there is thoughtfulness that goes into the production of poetry. The poet does not just wake up and start writing. He measures his words, measures the lines, calculates the language. So poetry has some level of mathematics associated with it. And that is done so as to maintain the beauty and rhythm that exists in nature. Because anything that is created comes from thoughtfulness, from creativity and imagination. Somebody had to sit down somewhere and thought about it. The desk that we have in this class did not just happen to be here one morning. Somebody came in and measured the class and then decided how many desks would be in the room and how many rows we will take depending on how we measure the desk. And that's why we see the beauty, the orderliness that we have in the rows that we have. That's poetry. Okay? So poetry is captured whenever there is beauty. Poetry is what? Captured whenever there is what? Whenever there is beauty, you can say that there is poetry there. Whenever there is beauty, you can certainly say that there is poetry there. For instance, all of you are poetic masterpieces. Okay? You are all poetry. You are all an embodiment of poetry. Alright? Because you are beautiful. And you're beauty, you're poetry. So if somebody says you are poetry, that means you have been well created. Okay? With beauty. You have been wonderfully made. Not fearfully made, but wonderfully made. We know that there are some people who are fearfully made, but they are not here with us. Okay? There's no one among us who is fearfully made. So I have also attempted a definition of poetry. I have also attempted a definition of poetry. Yours sincerely has also defined poetry. And this definition of poetry is contained in the collection Songs of Our Time. Songs of our time. Songs of our time. So in Songs of Our Time, in one of the poems in Songs of Our Time, I define poetry as time recorded in quotes. Time recorded in quotes. Poetry is time recorded in quotes. That means that poetry captures the moments in human history, the defining moments. Poetry captures the defining moments in human history. All right? But it is done in such a way that you have to read it in order to understand. Poetry talks about society in poetic, coded ways. Poetry talks about society in poetic and coded ways. In fact, there's a poem that I analyzed recently on my website. The poem is by Sly Cheney Coker. He's a poet from Sierra Leone, right? The poet from Sierra Leone. And the title of the poem is The Breast of the Sea. Breast of the sea. If you read the text of the poem, it will be difficult for you to say exactly what it means. Until you link it to the history of the society in which the poem was written. So you can check out that analysis on my website. eoitem.com. eoitem.com. Or you can just Google. If you Google my name, my website that comes up first against my name. So you just go. It's among the recent poem I analyzed, so you see it. So what I'm saying is that poetry is time recorded in quotes, right? Poetry is time recorded in quotes. Implies that the poet or poetry itself is always in response to occurrences in society. Poetry is always in what? In response to occurrences in society. Poetry is in response to what is happening in society. So the time captured in quotes. If there are quotes, then they have to be decoded. That means read with understanding, not to be understood. Without which you will just be reading words. So, that is my definition of poetry. In Songs of Our Time. In Songs of Our Time. Poetry is time recorded in quotes. Then I go on to say I'm going to say, and you can write. I'm going to say, and you can write. The mind of the poet. Okay, the mind is the poet, not the man. The mind is the poet, not the man. Not the man. The mind is the poet, not the man. The mind is the poet and not the man. The psyche that makes the poet and not the individual. The mind is the poet, not the man. The mind of the poet must be mad. The mind of the poet must be mad. The mind of the poet must be mad. Must be mad. M-A-D. The mind of the poet must be mad. The mind of the poet must be mad. Okay? It can't just be an ordinary mind. Poets do not have ordinary mind. They don't have the mind of ordinary people. Okay?
The mind of the poet must be mild or mad.
Must be mad. So that simply means, that's a metaphor. Remember, in poetry, we don't take words literally. Poets do not always communicate literally. Poets communicate figuratively. So the word mad should not be taken literally. It should be taken figuratively to imply a mind that is not ordinary, that's not simple, not a simple-minded mind. Okay? Extraordinary mind, so to speak. Okay? Mind that is not easily understood by ordinary people in society. So the mind of the poet must be mad, must be different. The poet has to think differently from the rest of the society. The poet does not always have to fit in. Because most times the masses do not even know their left from their right. So the poet cannot think like the masses. He is supposed to educate the masses and bring them out of their bondage, conscientize them, and make them understand the kind of time that they are living in. So he cannot have the same mind as them. His mind has to be extraordinary. Okay, so the mind of the poet must be mad. Then the madness of a poet must be mathematical. The madness of the poet must be mathematical. The madness of the poet must be mathematical. That means it has to be calculated. It has to be scientific. Okay? Like what is said in Hamlet. The kind of madness that Hamlet has. Okay? Kind of calculated madness. Which makes one of the characters to say there is a method to his madness. There's a method to his madness. There is a method to his madness. That's what one of the characters in Hamlet says about Hamlet's madness. That means not the madness that people rave on the street and pick things in the gutter, right? Yes. calculated. It is scientific. It is mathematical. So that's why that character says there is a method to his madness. So the madness of a poet must be what? Mathematical. Then the math itself must be simple. The math itself must be simple. The math itself, that's the mathematics. It should not be a difficult mathematics. Now we already said that poetry has some elements of mathematics to it because the poet has to calculate his words, calculate the lines. So the maths must be simple. So I align with Neil Shindari to say that the kind of poetry we write now, even though it is poetry, all right, must have double a level of meaning. It should be simple at the same time, so that most people in society will really understand. So the maths, at least we have simple maths, right? Like 1 plus 1, right? 1 plus 1 is not 2, it is 11. In poetry, it's 11. Okay? Ordinary people will say it is 2. But in poetry, we say it is 11. Okay? Okay? In poetry. Because that's poetry. Poetry is not based on the surface understanding. It's based on the deeper understanding. Okay? So that's how it works. Poetry challenges your mind to think differently. So the math itself must be simple. Since the quadratic of words destroys enthusiasm. Since the quadratic of words destroys. Since the quadratic of words destroys enthusiasm. By that I mean that if the poet uses difficult language, the reader might be bored. Reading the poem might not understand it and might be bored. Since the quadratic of words destroys what? Enthusiasm. To spell what? What should I spell? The quadratic is on the board. Enthusiasm. Are you enthusiastic about enthusiasm? So now I ask you, what is your own definition of poetry? I think you should go home and think about it. When you come back to class, I'll ask you to define poetry in your own words. Good afternoon.